My parents believed the favorite daughter and her false evidence that I betrayed the family to pay for college, but 10 years later, they realized their mistake when they're left with nothing. 10 years ago, my family kicked me out of the house because they assumed that I had apparently betrayed them to pay for my university tuition. I was only 18, about to leave for university, when my parents told me they no longer wanted me to live in their house. This was all thanks to my older sister Jenin. Jenin is 4 years older than me and had always been the golden child of the family. There was no doubt about that. It was very clear to me from my childhood that whatever I did, Jenin would always do it better, so I didn't even bother to compete. She went to business school, and everyone was very proud of her. But when I was accepted into a very reputable university in the UK to study history, she didn't take it well. My parents made it very clear that they couldn't afford the tuition, so I had to figure things out on my own. I even asked them to help me get a student loan and become co-signers, but they said they didn't want to take that risk. That was quite disappointing, and we ended up arguing a lot about it. They had paid for my sister to go to university, but they claimed that sending me would be too expensive, and they had to think about their future first, since they were planning to start a business at the same time. They didn't want to take on more risks than they could afford. I didn't know what to do because I felt they were trying to make things extra difficult for me, just so I would end up giving up on that opportunity. They had already told me they couldn't help with the tuition, and I knew there was no way they would help with other expenses, like travel and living costs. I knew that once there, I could work to pay for my studies, but I would at least need some help with the tuition. With no other option, I decided to approach my aunt. My aunt is my dad's older sister, and to be honest, she's a much better person than my parents. We've always had a good relationship, but I know my dad didn't like her much, and neither did my mom, so they tried to keep me away from her. We only saw each other at family gatherings and things like that, so I had to talk to her whenever I knew my dad wasn't around because he really didn't like it. He thought she was a bit arrogant, and every time he saw her, it apparently made him feel small. However, in her defense, I really don't think it was her fault. For context, she was 7 years older than my dad and is a neurosurgeon. My dad isn't a failure, but in comparison, everyone would say she was the more successful of the two. My parents were dentists and did well, but my dad always had the habit of comparing himself to his sister. No matter how hard she tried to be his friend, he kept feeling jealous of her and was so insecure that he couldn't even conceive of being her friend. She told me these things after I approached her once I was kicked out of my own house, so I could live with her until it was time for me to leave for university. We really bonded after I was kicked out since she became my only friend and confidant from then on as we lived together, and I would really like to thank Jenin for making sure that happened. After I asked my aunt for help, she gladly accepted, and I even begged her to keep everything a secret because I didn't want my dad to find out about any of this. He would lose his mind if he knew I had asked his sister for money. Jenin, however, found out somehow. One day, when I came home after hanging out with my friends, I noticed all my things were packed in boxes, ready to go. My parents were sitting in the living room, ready to confront me with a bunch of papers in their hands, and Jenin standing by their side with the most arrogant expression on her face. I still can't forget that image because, although it's been a whole decade since that day, I will never be able to forget or forgive the kind of humiliation I had to face that day. My father told me that Jenin had given them proof that I had betrayed the family to pay for my university tuition. I had no idea what he was talking about. I knew they had found out that I had asked my aunt for help to pay for tuition, but I wouldn't go as far as to say I betrayed the family. I tried to explain to them that I had no other choice, which is why I had approached her. Then my father threw the papers he had in his hand at my face, and when I looked at them, I realized they were screenshots, completely fabricated, of emails that had supposedly been exchanged between my aunt and me. Somehow, Jenin had created highly edited emails between my aunt and me, where I had apparently handed over the business model and other details of my parents' company, along with a list of potential investors, in exchange for her paying my tuition. I don't know how Jenin could have come up with something like that. I have to admit, it was a pretty clever move, and I can't imagine the number of hours it took her to come up with such an evil plan and then execute it, because the emails looked really authentic, and anyone would have been convinced they were real. However, when I looked through those papers, I immediately told my parents they weren't real and explained that Jenin was trying to trick them just to get me kicked out. I even offered to open my laptop and show them the truth, but they said they believed my sister and had implicit trust in her. They wanted me out of the house right then and there. I tried to beg them to let me stay because, even though I hated them with all my soul at that moment, I didn't want to be a burden on my aunt since she was already paying for my university. I didn't want to end up living with her as well. But my parents didn't budge and said they wanted me gone because I'd betrayed them and they couldn't stand me anymore. So, finally, I had to leave and ended up going to my aunt's house, where she treated me with the greatest kindness and respect, something I never received from my parents. Since then, she has been my only family. My parents never contacted me after that, and the only person who wrote to me after the incident was Jenin, but only to say that she was very happy I was gone. She was very vague when she wrote to me, so I couldn't use it against her. All she said was that I shouldn't leave my laptop lying around and that she had known something was wrong the moment I stopped arguing with our parents about the university money. I had told a couple of my friends about it, and I have a habit of leaving my laptop open, but usually only in my room. So I guess she had been snooping around my room to find something against me when she realized I had stopped arguing with our parents. She must have thought I had gotten the money I needed, and that's how she found out the information. She probably took screenshots of other emails, then edited and fixed everything with the help of Photoshop. In case anyone is still wondering how she managed to do it, it took me a long time to figure these things out myself, so I hope this satisfies the curiosity of anyone wondering. It's not relevant, but I thought I should mention it anyway. After that, I had no contact with my family, and it was my aunt who supported me through everything. She sent me to college, and then, once I graduated, she let me live with her until I found a job and could move out. I had hoped that maybe I could see my family at events or holidays, but they also cut ties with the rest of our family. My aunt told me it was because, now that they had established their own business, they were too proud and believed they were above everyone else since they were doing relatively well. My parents were dentists. My mother really loved being in the kitchen, as did my father, so they started a dessert shop for tooth-friendly treats, and it was a pretty unique concept. So, they were doing quite well. However, once they started succeeding, they cut ties with the rest of the family, and that's why no one had heard from them in the last 10 years. But then the pandemic happened a couple of years ago, and many businesses like theirs took a serious hit. I guess they did too, which probably explains why my parents decided to contact me a couple of days ago. I don't know where they got my number from, and it was completely unexpected, but I was at work when they called me. My mother asked if I had a moment to talk to them. I was about to hang up without even responding, but I tried to handle it calmly. I told her I would talk to her once I got home to give myself some time to think about whether I wanted to talk to her or not, as it had been 10 years since I last spoke to my parents. I was also a bit curious about why they were calling me after so long. So once I got home from work, I decided to call them back. When I did, they initially tried to make small talk, but I told them to cut it out because it was only making me more upset. I told them to get to the point. Finally, my mother told me that the real reason she was calling was to apologize and make amends with me. She wanted me to come and meet her and my father, because they had realized what a huge mistake they had made 10 years ago by kicking me out of the house in favor of my sister. Since then, that decision had really backfired on them. She hinted at certain things during our phone call, and I tried to get her to talk about them. But she said she wanted me to visit her and my father the next day, so we could talk about things in detail. I tried very hard to get her to talk over the phone, but she insisted that I visit just once. So, I went to their place the next day in the afternoon after work, and I was very surprised that the address they gave me was not the house I grew up in, but an apartment in a really bad neighborhood. I had no idea why they had to move out of our old house to such an apartment, but once I sat down with them and talked to them, I realized it was because I had assumed correctly. The business had suffered a lot during the pandemic, and unfortunately, it forced them to sell their house and many of their assets to stay afloat because they weren't making any money. My parents seemed happy to see me, but they mainly just wanted to talk about how hard they had it. They told me that even during the pandemic, my sister, with a business degree, had the brilliant idea to sell everything they had to keep up with the bills. Instead of shutting the business down for a while and starting over later, she thought it would be a better idea to invest even more money to get things going after the first phase. That turned out to be a mistake because it didn't take off as expected. Even after the pandemic had passed, the business was still struggling, but Jenin had faith that it would eventually do better. However, my parents really regret investing all their money into it because now they're the ones facing the losses. They told me that apparently, Jenin takes all the money the business makes and keeps most of it for herself. She gives them just enough to get by, since she took over the business a couple of years ago and made them sign all the documents. They did it because they assumed she would be capable and competent and never imagined she would treat them like this. But they were struggling to make ends meet, and most of the money earned from the business went straight into her pockets. They had to beg and plead for money each time. They had no other choice since they had already given her everything they had in the past, and now they were completely broke. So, of course, now they were asking me for help, and that's the real reason they reconnected with me after 10 years, to ask if I would be willing to help in this situation since they're in a tough spot. But I told them immediately that I had bad news because there was no way I would help or support them in any way. It's not that I couldn't afford it, I just didn't think they deserved it. They never cared about me, so now that they're in trouble, it was pretty unreasonable for them to expect me to help them. I told them all this directly to their faces because I sensed this was coming when I walked into the house itself, since there literally couldn't be any other reason for them to call me. Besides, they were dentists. They could always go back to working in their profession instead of just expecting everything to be solved by their daughters. First, the business, and now asking me for money. Anyway, after telling them I couldn't help or support them, I decided to get up and leave. My parents tried to stop me, saying that I shouldn't act this way and that they were counting on me since my sister had turned her back on them. I didn't even bother to explain myself. I told them it was really sad that my sister had done that to them, but I was doing the same because I didn't owe anyone anything. Then I left as soon as I could, but they have been bothering me since then, trying to call me from various numbers and sending me text messages, telling me that I need to help them because they are in serious financial trouble. I don't think anyone would think I'm the bad person here for not helping, but the rules are the rules. So I have to ask, am I the bad one for not helping my parents after they believed my sister instead of me? Update 1. Thank you so much for your comments. I'm going to stick to my decision not to help my parents because they don't deserve it, as I mentioned before. I also discussed this with my aunt, and she said that if my father really needed help that badly, he could have turned to her after I refused, but he chose not to. Anyway, it's not our problem what they're going through. It's been 10 years since they kicked me out of the house, and they couldn't even offer me an honest and sincere apology. They only contacted me because they wanted me to support them. It infuriates me every time I think about it, and I feel like I shouldn't have responded to them in the first place. But anyway, at least I did my part and went to visit them, although partly out of curiosity, I must admit. Even then, they couldn't offer an apology that was adequate enough to try to repair our relationship. It was also pretty stupid of them to keep investing more and more money in their business and in their daughter, knowing that there was a pandemic going on and they had no idea if they could survive it or not. I don't think anyone should have to bear the consequences of their idiotic decisions, so they can keep texting me and trying to contact me. I'm not going to let it bother me. Update 2. Hello, 2 weeks ago, I visited my parents, and after that, I practically had no contact with them. They kept trying to talk to me, but I didn't respond. After a week, they even stopped trying, so I thought they had given up. My aunt was expecting my father to reach out to her instead, but even that didn't happen, and we were quite relieved. However, last night, Jenin showed up at my house. I don't know how she found out where I live, but I wasn't expecting her. The icing on the cake was that my aunt had come over for dinner last night, so Jenin was able to talk to both of us at the same time. When I saw her standing outside through the peephole, I decided not to let her in. I even told her that we weren't willing to talk to her, so she needed to leave. However, she was quite argumentative and said that what she needed to discuss with us was urgent and that she had no interest in being around us otherwise. She told me that she would wait outside all night if necessary, and that she knew my aunt was inside because she had seen the car parked outside. Eventually, I had to let her in because I didn't want any drama outside my house. Once inside, she sat down and began telling us that she knew about the conversation I had had with my parents 2 weeks ago. She said it wasn't right to reject them and that they were very disappointed with how I had behaved. At that moment, I was quite irritated because she had no right to comment on how I should behave. She was the one who kicked me out of the house all those years ago and is the main reason why I don't have a good relationship with my parents. Besides, my parents weren't good parents in the first place. Then she went on to say that now that I had disappointed my parents again, she was giving me the chance to redeem myself. She also told my aunt that she hadn't been a good sister to my father for many years. This was our chance to do better. Jenin said she wanted us to invest in the business so she could continue without losing more money. She said this could be our payment because our parents had done so much for me. She even reminded my aunt of certain incidents from her childhood where my father had been there for her. Obviously, it was a script she had prepared with our parents and was now testing on us. Unfortunately for her and my parents, We are not that emotional and definitely not foolish." I got very angry and told her to leave. She made it seem like there was something really urgent to discuss, but this was what she considered urgent. I didn't care. When I told her to leave, we started arguing. She said I was being really cruel because our parents had many health problems, and it seemed like I didn't care. I told her that even if I cared, I wouldn't be willing to do anything until they apologized sincerely, which seemed unlikely because they didn't even think they had anything to apologize for. My aunt said the way things were going was despicable and that Jenin needed to leave. After that, things got really ugly. We had a nasty verbal fight. Jenin said many things that were out of line, and I ended up doing the same. All the resentment I had been holding on to for the last 10 years came to the surface and out of my mouth. We were very close to getting into a physical fight, but my aunt intervened and told Jenin to leave the house because she was provoking me. She didn't want a physical confrontation because that wouldn't end well for either of us. Finally, Jenin left after a lot of cursing and fighting. A full day has passed since then, but I'm still not over it. My aunt stayed the night because she could see I was in a really bad state. I had a complete breakdown after Jenin left and started crying because of how terrible she had made me feel. It felt like I had gone back to my childhood when everyone was against me, and it was really traumatic. Anyway, I'm feeling a little better now, but I'm still pretty angry and hurt. Update 3. Hi, it's been 3 days since my last update. This morning, my aunt told me that she received a call from her brother. She told him that she planned to visit him in the afternoon. So I told her I would go with her to prevent them from ambushing and trying to manipulate her, as they tried to do with me. My aunt is more compassionate, and I thought it would be easier to deal with her. I told her I would go with her. A couple of hours ago, I visited my parents again, but this time with my aunt. When we arrived, my parents seemed surprised to see me, but they pretended it was okay and started telling my aunt the same things they had told me. But I interrupted them in the middle and told them that she already knew everything because she was the only person who had been on good terms with me after they kicked me out. So I had told her everything because she is my family. I interrupted their speech, and after that, they no longer knew how to victimize themselves because I had exposed them. So they directly asked my aunt if she would be willing to help them with money. My aunt tried to be diplomatic and said she would think about it, but she needed time. She told them they couldn't bother her as they had tried to do with me in the meantime. That's when my parents got very defensive and said they weren't trying to bother me. They were just trying to take care of themselves because they were in desperate need, and desperate times call for desperate measures. So, I took the opportunity to confront them about what they had done to me. I asked them why they hadn't offered financial support or any sense of stability when I was desperate to go to college. But now they suddenly expected the family to help them. That seemed unrealistic and somewhat unfair to me. I told them I hadn't asked for an explanation the first time I visited because they had nothing satisfactory to say, and honestly, I didn't care either. But now, since they insisted on asking for help, I wanted them to explain things to me because none of this made sense. Anyway, once I asked them to explain their past actions, they started coming up with a bunch of excuses for why they had treated me the way they did. I don't understand why it was so hard for them just to come out and say they didn't like me in the past and had always preferred my sister over me. It was literally so easy. All they had to do was admit it, and I would know they were being honest and sincere now at least. But they kept trying to find various reasons for why they had behaved with me the way they did, mainly trying to blame me by pretending that I wasn't really connected with them and that I behaved very differently from my sister, who tried and really put effort into getting along with my parents. They talked as if we were all in a relationship and I wasn't making any effort, as if I literally wasn't their daughter, and they were the ones who should have made an effort to make me feel comfortable and safe, which they never did. It was funny, to be honest, watching them try so desperately because I knew they didn't have any real reason, and they didn't want to be honest because they wanted to play it safe and be clever. But I could see through them, and I let them go on and on while I didn't say anything. I just watched them struggle with my aunt, and toward the end, realizing they had nothing to say to justify or defend themselves. They ended up saying they hadn't counted on me being the more successful sister, and that's why they had treated me that way. And that made it so hard for me not to laugh out loud because, while it was incredibly insulting, it was also very funny because they were ensuring we wouldn't help them at all. Once they finished, my aunt and I told them we would think about supporting them and would let them know in a few days. Then we left, and they really asked us to consider it At least because that would be very helpful for them and also for Janine. It was hard for me not to roll my eyes in front of them, but anyway, after we left, my aunt and I had a little discussion and concluded that we wouldn't give them any money. I knew that from the start, but my aunt had her doubts. Anyway, we'll tell them in a few days, and I'll be back with another update. Update 4. We just got back from a diner near my aunt's house because we didn't want to be at her place when we told them we weren't going to help them. I had an idea before giving them the answer, which was to ask if they were willing to cut ties with my sister in exchange for the money to help them, as a sort of test. But the answer was a bit obvious, with them saying they couldn't cut their golden child out of their lives. Although, of course, they didn't say golden child. That's just something people from the outside can see. Some might think that if they had said yes, I would have lent them money. But the truth is, I knew the answer, I just wanted to confirm it. And even if they had said yes, it would probably have been a lie. When they answered that, I told them it was fine, but we wouldn't be able to lend them money. Partly because my sister was to blame for the business failing so badly. So it was a bad investment for us. My mother almost had a breakdown because she got very nervous. Maybe because this was her last option before losing the business. She was so shaken that at one point she knocked over a coffee cup and it fell to the floor. She didn't do it on purpose, but it was easy to see that this affected her. Anyway, when we saw there wasn't much else to say, my aunt and I got up and left, though we didn't cover our part of the bill. My aunt because she forgot, but I noticed at the time and just walked away. And that's my update for now. I hope there's nothing more to tell in the future. If there is, I'll come back with more. Update 5. If I did my calculations right, it's been 3 months since I last posted here. And just the other day, while looking for something on Reddit, I saw that I had some notifications from people asking about my story. So I decided to make this update instead of replying personally to each one. In the end, my parents' business was closed down because their golden child couldn't do anything to save it. The interesting thing was the things that were revealed from all of this when it finally happened. First of all, what explains why my parents never went back to being dentists, even though it's a very lucrative profession. The reason is that my father lost his license because a patient sued him. I won't go into details because I'm not sure if it's legal to talk about that or not. But he was left without a job. That's why they didn't want to pay for my college. They were using their savings at the time and were about to open their business. I know all of this because they had a meeting with my aunt shortly after. They still have some sort of relationship, but I haven't seen them. My mother could keep working, but she was tired and wanted to do something else. So once the idea of this business came up, she jumped on board as soon as she could. At least she still has her license, which allows them to support themselves now because she's the only one working out of the two since my father can't practice and doesn't want to take another job that isn't up to his standards, as he said. But well, a dentist's salary in the family isn't little, even if they're used to a lifestyle that's now difficult for them to maintain. As for my sister, since I haven't talked much about her, the only thing I know is that she's working as a secretary. The reason is that her business degree wasn't from a good university, so it wasn't very valuable. Add to that the fact that she wasn't very good in the field, plus her lack of experience. Since a failed business isn't something you want to show off, she couldn't get a good job, not even money to start another business. So now she works as that. And that's all I have to update. My aunt and I are doing well and continuing to live our lives, which is important.